Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today we're speaking with Dr. Ben Powell about sweatshops. Dr. Powell is the director of the Free Market Institute and a professor in the Rawls College of Business at Texas Tech. He's a senior fellow with the Independent Institute and the North American editor of the Review of Austrian Economics. He is the author of Out of Poverty, Sweatshops and the Global Economy. You can follow his work at benjaminwpowell.com and fmi.ttu.edu. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/sweatshops. Ben, welcome to the show.
All right, good to be with you guys.
So first, let's just get some simple definitions out of the way. What is a sweatshop?
So the term sweatshop is applied in a pejorative sense to manufacturing plants in the third world, typically that are making apparel or other things for first world countries. They are characterized by having very low pay by standards that we in the United States or Europe are used to, and also having poor working conditions relative to what we're used to, and that can include long and unpredictable hours, unsafe working conditions where you have a risk of injury on the job, or like the tragic fires and factory collapses we've seen in Bangladesh, and also unhealthy working conditions where over time particles in the air can build up and cause illnesses, and generally unpleasant working conditions. These kind of collectively define what a sweatshop is, although there's no bright line definition that allows you to point to one firm in a poorer country and say that one's a sweatshop, all the other ones not. It's more a matter of judgment when looking across all of these things.
Sure. Can you give us a brief history of sweatshops and a sense of how and why sweatshops originated?
Well, the brief history is that there's a long history of them, dating back to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Sweatshops are not new. They became more new in the public conscience in the 1990s after a number of campaigns to expose the wages and working conditions in places like Indonesia and other poorer countries. But I know of no country today that is rich, that isn't just rich off of its mineral resources or something like that, that didn't go through a stage of development that was characterized by having manufacturing done in something that looks similar to a sweatshop today. Great Britain had them when they went through their Industrial Revolution. I'm from a city called Haverhill, Massachusetts originally. Haverhill was known as the shoe city because of its 19th century shoe production there. And the types of wages and working conditions that existed in those factories would be similar to what we see in so-called sweatshops today. In fact, I did my undergraduate at the University of Massachusetts at Lowell, the heart of the Industrial Revolution here in the 19th century America, where sweatshops operated there, and women moved from rural areas, much like they do in China today, to come work in the sweatshops, and then were later replaced by immigrants. So sweatshops' history is actually quite long, but in the more modern times, it's been since the mid to late 1990s in particular that there's kind of been an anti-sweatshop movement in the United States and other parts of the world.
And why does that movement exist? What are some of the reasons that sweatshops are so vilified here in the U.S.?
Well, I think people quite naturally, when they learn of the type of wages and working conditions that many people in poorer parts of the world toil under, feel bad about it for those workers and take offense to the fact that they don't have a better standard of living. But the reaction is emotional rather than intellectual, because they're not comparing the sweatshops. They're realistically available alternatives in other parts of the world. And often the things that they would agitate for policy-wise to try to address these ills would make the very workers that they care about worse off by throwing them into worse alternatives and getting rid of the jobs that are part of the process of economic development that eventually lifts living standards. So I think it's a combination of a natural emotional reaction when people become aware of it, which in the age of internet and cable television, people started becoming increasingly aware of it. But that coupled with economic ignorance is largely responsible for much of the anti-sweatshop movement today.
So how does price theory help explain the existence of sweatshops?
Well, price theory is what makes the world go around. I think at the most basic level on the sweatshop issue, to understand wage formation is necessary. So wages are determined largely by two forces, kind of an upper bound is the productivity of the workers. So how much revenue do they create for the firm? If a worker can create $2 a day worth of revenue for the firm, anytime you mandate wages higher than $2 a day, that factory is not going to hire the worker, or they're going to lay them off if they already work there. That's the upper bound of compensation. The lower bound is whatever the worker's next best alternative is, because firms would, ideally in their mind, like to pay the workers nothing and pocket the entire revenue as profits. What constrains them from doing that is they have to make an offer better than what that worker could get elsewhere. That's the lower bound. Actual wages fall somewhere in between, although the lion's share of differences in wages across countries is explained by productivity differences. So most of the game is trying to move the upper bound if we care about improving the lives of these workers. And all too often, the anti-sweatshop activists will endorse some sort of minimum or living wage for these countries that doesn't move either of those bounds, but simply mandates higher pay. And mandating higher pay doesn't instantly make the workers more productive, so it risks throwing them out of their jobs in the factories and into other what I'd call worse alternatives. There's a reason workers choose to work in the factories when given the option, and it's generally because the wages and working conditions are better than what they can get in other sectors of the economy. That's why they choose to work there.
Now, you obviously mentioned in your answer there what happens when legislation regarding wages is implemented. But what about legislation regarding child labor and working conditions? Because a lot of times you'll hear people in the anti-sweatshop camp advocating for child labor laws and improved working conditions via legislation in these third world countries where you have sweatshops.
Sure. So let's take those two separately. Let's take working conditions first and then look at child labor.
Sure.
So again, price theory plays a prominent role here. So in economics, we call it compensating differentials. It's your wages and working conditions are tied together. So if we think about this in a less controversial context in the United States, why do garbage men get paid so much? Because the job is unpleasant. So given the skill level of people doing the job, it's unpleasant and unsafe. In order to compensate for that negative part of their job, they get paid a little bit more than what similarly educated people would in other fields. Conversely, something like your average musician who's not a rock star gets paid very little because there's many people who would like to do the job almost for free. So wages and working conditions are tied together. Now, if we think about it from an employee standpoint, or just yourself, when you think about your job, you care about both the money you get paid and the working conditions of how safe or how dangerous it is there, and just how generally pleasant your job is. An employer is largely indifferent. They care how much the laborer costs. Whether that $2 a day that I used earlier is paid to workers in the form of wages entirely, or whether it's $1.50 in wages and spending 50 cents a day per worker on other improvements in working conditions through increased safety or health insurance, vacation time, what have you. A cost is a cost is a cost to the employer. They largely don't care. But this means if employees do care and employers are indifferent of how the bundle of pay is allocated between wages and other benefits, I mean, it's largely going to be employee preferences that drive the mix of compensation. Because if they didn't, employers would be paying a cost that is greater than the value the employee gets from it. That means if the profit-maximizing employer remixes that package, they could save themselves money and make the workers no worse off. So why then do we see such bad working conditions in the third world? Well, it's because total compensation, that upper bound, is really low. And when it's really low, put yourself in the position of a poor worker in one of these countries desperately trying to feed, clothe, and shelter your family. You're going to want the vast majority of what meager compensation you do get to come in the form of wages. And you're willing to tolerate very unsafe working conditions in order to get that little bit more in wages. Now, over time, how we see these things change is as productivity goes up, total compensation goes up. And as total compensation goes up, employees demand greater health and safety on the job. Employers respond by giving more to them. Largely, this is the story that you see in the United States, Great Britain, and other industrialized countries. We didn't put in the type of laws that activists agitate for third world workers today when we were as poor as those countries. The United States grew wealthier and largely adopted laws that codified what industry practice was already changing to anyway, because the process of competition for employees, as productivity went up, already was forcing them to make the changes. So when activists try to separate out, the the semi-intelligent activist version here. Well, I understand I can't just mandate higher pay, but instead I want to improve their working conditions. They have to realize that these two things are linked. And if you advocate for laws that mandate higher safety standards and better working conditions, it's either going to raise the total cost of compensation and make employers less willing to hire these workers and throw them into worse alternatives, or it's going to make employers reshuffle the package away from employee preferences towards first world activist preferences who aren't actually living these lives. So that's why I think that attempts to mandate better working conditions are ultimately doomed to failure, just like mandating higher wages.
So are there any merits to protesting sweatshops because of low wages, child labor, or poor working conditions?
For the most part, I'm going to say no. And let's take the issue of child labor here that you brought up before and again just now. Child labor doesn't occur because parents are mean or stupid. It's another product of the poverty that these people are faced with. And the family judges it in its best interest for them and the child, for the child to work and contribute some meager earnings towards supporting the family. We don't interact with most child labor around the world. Children in countries that have sweatshops are more likely working in agriculture than any other industry, often subsistence agriculture that's never exported. Or they're working in domestic services, and by that I mean house cleaning, cooking, and things like that around wealthier people's homes. The least populated industry among those three is manufacturing when it comes to the children who are working in these countries. Most are in service, domestic services, or agriculture. A minority of them are in manufacturing. But manufacturing is generally more remunerative than the other two sectors. So when we are appalled by child labor and say, we don't want to buy the products made with child labor, it doesn't end the poverty that these families and the children face. Instead, it ends the demand for the manufactured products that children are making and results in more of them going into household services or agriculture, or worse, as a famous instance in Bangladesh happened when U.S. Congressman Tom Harkin proposed banning imports from Bangladesh because they were made with child labor. Oxfam investigated and found that factories unemployed thousands of children, that many became prostitutes or starved. Clearly, worse alternatives than working in a factory. And when it comes to agriculture, the primary sector employing the children, not only is the pay lower, but actually rates of child injury in agriculture are higher than they are in manufacturing. So this is, again, a case where you must think with your head and not with your heart. The real way child labor ends is through the process of development. It's as countries become a little bit richer, families can afford to get their children out of the workforce, and they overwhelmingly do so. The best study I saw of this is a couple of Dartmouth economists tracked individual families in Vietnam throughout the 1990s and looked at, as income changed, what happened to child labor participation rates. And they found all the action was around the extreme poverty lines. So one, it was around, about an 1,800 calorie per day diet, something like that. Once the family earned enough that each family member could have at least that many calories, you saw rates of child labor plummet. Then again, right around Vietnam's official poverty line, was another big shift in getting rid of child labor as individual family incomes surpassed that. That's the main cure for child labor. If we look around the globe, you could divide the countries up by kind of fifths of countries. It's the bottom fifth of the countries, the ones with average incomes below around $3,000, where about close to a third of the children work. After that, it gets down under 10% in the next group, down to, by the time you get up to an average income in your country, around $11,000, adjusting for purchasing power, child labor is virtually non-existent. And it's this process of development that is responsible for pulling the kids out. We in the United States didn't have a national anti-child labor law until 1938. And at that point, adjusted to today's dollars, the U.S. per capita income was around $10,500, precisely the spot where you see child labor not existing around the world today. Again, it's an instance of passing a law that codifies what's already going on. Now, the United States had individual states that had anti-child labor laws. My home state of Massachusetts, I believe, was the nation's first in the 1840s. But the content of the law, what it says is, children under 12 can't work more than 10 hours per day in a factory. So 13, 14, that's fine, no restriction. Under 12, 10 hours per day, 6 days a week, 60-hour work week, not uncommon in a sweatshirt, that's perfectly legal too. In short, the anti-child labor laws simply weren't binding in practice. The economists who have looked at anti-child labor laws and mandatory school attendance laws during the progressive era in the early 20th century find that once you control for increases in income, that these laws had very little effect on either school attendance or labor force participation by children. So I think the laws are completely unnecessary. It's something that instead takes a family that's in an extreme poverty situation and makes their poverty a little bit worse when we react by not buying products made with child labor.
So to move on to another objection that you'll sometimes hear from people in the anti-sweatshop camp, you'll hear this objection that major multinational companies, these large corporations, have excessive profits, and that they could instead give some of those profits to their employees in the form of higher wages. When people make claims like that, what are they missing about profits and their role they play, and also what are they getting wrong about sweatshops that leads them to perpetuate that myth?
So, two things here. One, when they act as if, actually three things. First, most sweatshop employment is not done by large multinational corporations. It's by domestic subcontractors in third world countries who get contracts from the multinationals. That said, it doesn't invalidate the argument that the multinationals themselves have a lot of resources. But, however, saying that's the second point of this, to say that the multinational has a lot of profits, and then to imply that therefore we should be able to legislate higher pay and the firm will simply pay it, misconstrues the choices that the firms face. Nike, of course, if you made Nike pay an extra $1 per hour to its third world workers, Nike would not close shop and cease making shoes. But that's not the decision that Nike or any of these other firms have of to make apparel or not make apparel. Their question is, how should we make apparel? And on the margin, how much more capital should we use? How much labor? How much low-skilled labor? How much high-skilled labor? When we mandate increases in the price of one of the inputs, namely low-skilled labor from poorer countries, that's going to make the relative attractiveness of producing with more capital and fewer workers, or higher-skilled, higher-pay workers in other countries, more attractive on the margin than doing it with the third world workers that they were currently employing. So just recognizing a pool of profits does not mean that therefore you can mandate they do something with it, because the firms are still greedy profit maximizers, and when you change the relative prices they face, they're going to reorganize how they make the production. And when they do that in response to higher wage or safety mandates for these poorer workers, it's going to result in more of them losing their factory jobs and getting sent into less lucrative and sometimes more dangerous sectors of the economies. Third, now, as not a matter of law, but as a matter of individual company policy, if they're highly profitable and if they would like to make a gift to certain third world workers by paying a higher wage, they're certainly free to do so, the same way corporations across the United States engage in all sorts of different charitable giving, or charitable giving for particular PR purposes and what they think it will enhance for their brand value. I don't think there's anything inherently counterproductive about that. However, I think we do have to be very careful as it starts to touch on the issue of fair trade, of what's actually going on, because often in things that are labeled fair trade, what you find is where they're complying with the letter of the mandate or their declared policy, but not the spirit. So it would be very easy for a firm to claim that, we have increased the pay of all of our workers, we only pay a living wage. And that sounds like this is good, that they're helping workers, but if you find that they relocated their production from Indonesia to, say, Mexico, where pay and productivity is higher, it doesn't mean they actually improve the lives of the most impoverished workers, but that they did a kind of PR scam to make consumers feel better about the product.
So what are the alternatives to sweatshop labor in third world countries, and how do the wages compare?
Sure. So this is something I spent more than a decade studying. The way that we went about it is that we looked at what do activists call a sweatshop that get reported in major U.S. and international news sources, and then we compare the incomes quoted in those articles to living standards in the countries in which they operate during those time periods. And what you find is, compared to the extreme poverty, and let's just take the example of Bangladesh, because that's the one that's been in the news most recently. Over the total period of time that sweatshops have been reported in the news in Bangladesh, you had about 85% of the population on average living under $2 a day, adjusting for purchasing power. Over half the population living on under $1.25 a day. Just massive, extreme poverty. Working in the sweatshops, on average in Bangladesh, lifted the workers, and this is the very sweatshops that are reported in the U.S. news sources, lifted those workers above the $2 a day threshold. In fact, in every country that we looked at, there were significant chunks of the population below that $2 a day threshold, and in every single country, on average, looking at the reported sweatshops, lifted the workers above those standards. In some countries, it lifted them well above those standards, in fact, well above average incomes in the countries. It's precisely because these jobs pay more that workers voluntarily go work for them, because compared to the lousy set of options that they have, these are relatively better, which means when we do things that destroy some of the sweatshop jobs, the workers are going into worse alternatives.
Okay, and another criticism that you'll hear from the anti-sweatshop movement regards the lack of education for minors in these third world countries when they decide to work in sweatshops. Is there any merit to that criticism, and what can you say about the lack of education in many cases that goes along with the children who decide to work in sweatshops?
When you say lack of education, do you mean lack of formal schooling as an option or as a history, or lack of knowledge about what sweatshops are like?
I mean lack of formal schooling for these children.
Oh, I think government schooling systems around the world are a disaster and don't do a very good job of providing education. But what you do find is in very poor countries all over the globe, there's thousands and thousands of small private schools that operate, that cater to the poorest of the poor. There's a man, Tooley, in the United Kingdom, who's done great work documenting the presence of these private, for-pay schools that operate in very poor neighborhoods all around the world and do it for pennies a day. So I think it's a little bit of a myth to say that there is no educational option available for these children.
Sure, and I guess I should clarify some of what I'm saying here. Because yes, I am familiar with Tooley's work, with James Tooley's work, and these and his discussion of the low-cost private schools around the world. But a lot of the time, you'll hear from these anti-sweatshop activists that because of the long hours that are involved with working in a sweatshop and the long work weeks that go with working in a sweatshop, that these children are unable to experience a formal education of some sort. And that objection is often brought up. And while we may disagree with them on the benefits of that formal education, what are the economic factors that go along with swatting away that objection?
I see. Well, the fact is most children who work also do get education. It's kind of a myth that the two are entirely mutually exclusive. But I do think there can be a role for activism here if properly channeled. The key is when children choose to work in factories, it's because they believe it's the least bad option they have for them and their family. So the main thing that motivates that choice is their extreme poverty and the wages they can earn there. I think instead of passing mandatory school attendance laws or anti-child labor laws, the correct response for activists, what we do want to do is expand the choice set. So if you would like to start a anti-child labor NGO that is a charity and collect donations, and then go pay children to go to school. If you pay children to go to school, it solves the problem that they were going to the factory farm in the first place and results in them getting an education. I think there's nothing anti-market, anti-civil society, or anti-development about that.
Absolutely. And I know we talked about this briefly, but I got one more question for you before we start to wrap up here. What are the effects of these sweatshop boycotts and protectionist legislation that these activists are pushing in order to try and help people in these third world countries?
Well, let me say this, that the anti-sweatshop activist movement has been very good at getting public attention. It's been pretty good at getting, by good I don't mean in a normative sense here, pretty effective at getting at least lip service from companies about corporate social responsibility codes. What it's not been very successful at is actually getting labor standards imposed on trade agreements and legislation passed. And over time, in terms of boycotts, the groups have come to appreciate, I think, albeit a bit begrudgingly, that boycotts are not an effective means of helping workers overall and should only be used in very limited circumstances. But in terms of the actual trade agreements and prohibitions on this, they haven't been particularly effective at getting the bans in place, and I argue that that's a good thing if we care about the welfare of these workers.
Sure. So are there any solutions that you can see to any sweatshop-related issues that are actual issues and not just myths that are spread by those in the anti-sweatshop camp?
You know what? I think we have to be careful, because when I characterize from the anti-sweatshop camp as myths, as their solutions are myths, the problems are real. I mean, I certainly hope for third world workers who are currently in these sweatshops and their children that better pay and better working conditions are on the horizon for them. Because I think that all humans should aspire to having a better standard of living than what they currently do. So I think problems are real. Proposed solutions are myths. Instead, we need to think about things that increase the workers' productivity and raise living standards. Unfortunately, I think the main determinant of economic development is the institutional environment. And by that, I mean an environment that has a tolerable degree of rule of law, protects private property rights and contracts, and grants a tolerable degree of economic freedom. Put that in place, and a country will grow, and it'll move past the stage of sweatshops. So in the United States, Great Britain, that's more than a 100-year process, but all the capital and technology has to be created anew. The East Asian tigers post-World War II, Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea, these were all sweatshop places in the 1950s with pre-industrial standards of living. In a generation, they moved to first world status. So I think the process can happen quicker now when the right environment is in place. Unfortunately, I think it's very difficult to give a country that right environment from the outside. It's largely a path that has to be enforced by the hearts and minds of the citizens in those countries. In the meantime, what we in the West can do for them is more limited. Trade with them more freely. That marginally increases their productivity by increasing the revenue that they can create for the firm when they export the products. Also, it has the benefit of what we come to call a little bit of contagious capitalism, as freer countries, when they trade with less free ones, less free tend to become a little bit more free over time. The biggest thing you can do if you care about the lives of these workers is increase migration to the United States and other wealthy countries. The main factor that limits their productivity is their lousy government policies in these countries. Take a Haitian out of Haiti, a country where sweatshops have been reported, drop them in the United States, and almost overnight their income on average goes up by 1,000%. It's not that they didn't have human capital that could create value for others. It's that the lousy environments in Haiti produced by that government kind of shackles humans' ultimate resource, their own creativity and ability to create value for others, by not letting them use the human capital that they have. So trade more freely with them and agitate for greater number of visas for workers from those countries to come to the United States. I think these are things that we could do in the short run that would help them out on the margin.
Well, and I think that's a great point that you made at the very end that Daniel and I neglected to bring up. But in a lot of these countries, maybe even all these countries where you have sweatshops, Honduras, Haiti, Bangladesh, countries of that nature, you have, in many cases, you have governments that have enacted numerous scores and scores of regulations and of legislation that get in the way and prevent economic development and economic growth from occurring.
Sure. I mean, look at you can use the very popular Economic Freedom of the World annual report, freetheworld.org, and look up the economic freedom of these countries where sweatshops located. Invariably, you usually find them in lower freedom places, although not the lowest freedom places, quite typically. Show me a country that's free or improving its freedom and has sweatshops. It's rapidly going to move through that sweatshop phase of economic development and become healthier. Unfortunately, for the less free countries that aren't improving, sweatshops are across the least bad option for the workers in the interim until those institutions improve.
Sure. All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. What are the best ways to follow your work, and what do you recommend someone read if they're interested in learning more about the topics we've been discussing today?
Well, definitely pick out my book that came out last year, or actually a couple of years ago now, Out of Poverty, Sweatshops in the Global Economy. But you can also Google my name and sweatshops and find all sorts of material online or on my website, benjaminwpowell.com, or stuff at Texas Tech University at fmi.ttu.edu.
Okay, great. Well, I want to remind everybody to check out the show notes page for this episode. That's wakeupcallpodcast.com/sweatshops. And we'll link to Out of Poverty and BenjaminWPowell.com and the Free Market Institute. And again, the website for that is fmi.ttu.edu. All the resources we mentioned over the course of the interview will have links there. So wakeupcallpodcast.com/sweatshops is the show notes page and the place to go for this episode. And I want to encourage everybody to sign up for our email list and to subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher, or the podcatcher of your choice, so that you can stay up to date on what's going on with the show and make sure to never miss an episode. And Ben, thank you very much for joining us today to take a closer look at sweatshops, and hopefully we'll be able to speak with you again sometime in the future.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes, or subscribe on Stitcher, and check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.